I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking at the old clock on the wall, when the phone rang. It wasn't time for anyone to call. My heart raced before I even answered, as if my body knew something was wrong. The voice on the other end was polite, too professional for that silent morning. They said my full name, confirmed my age, and then talked about a dosage I didn't recognize. I was speechless. Not because of confusion, but because of a chill that went up my spine. Something there didn't match my memory or my routine. The attendant insisted, saying that medication had been adjusted recently. I squeezed the phone tightly, trying to collect my thoughts. I have always been careful with my medications. Even with my age, I knew exactly what I was taking, at what time, and why. That information was not part of my life. When I tried to explain this, the voice on the other end hesitated. There was a short but heavy silence before she said that the change had been confirmed by a responsible family member. Responsible family member. Those two words kept echoing in my head. I hung up the phone with shaky hands. The kitchen looked different, as if the air had become denser. I looked at the jars lined up near the sink, all arranged by my daughter the night before. I remembered the firm way she had taken the pills out of my hand, saying that I was too forgetful to take care of it alone. At that moment, for the first time, I felt ashamed. Not from me, but from having accepted it without question. Something inside me started screaming, even though I didn't know exactly what yet. I got up slowly and went to the bedroom, trying to calm my heart. Each step felt heavier than the other. I sat on the bed and took a deep breath, but the feeling that something was out of place did not go away. It wasn't fear of dying. It was fear that I was missing something before that. My autonomy, my voice, my truth. I thought about calling my daughter right away, but a part of me hesitated. For the first time in many years, I was afraid to confront her. When she arrived that afternoon, she came in smiling, as always. He asked if I had lunch, if I was feeling well, if I had taken the medicines correctly. I watched every gesture, every word, as if I were seeing someone else. When I mentioned the call from the office, her smile faltered for a second, barely noticeable. She replied too quickly, saying that it must be a mistake, that I was worrying for nothing. That rush hurt me more than any physical symptom. She picked up the vials and began to explain them, talking to me as if I were a child. I felt something break inside me. I had raised that woman. She had worked, suffered, been widowed too soon, and now she was treated as someone incapable of understanding her own life. I wanted to scream, but I remained silent. Silence, at that moment, was my only defense. Something told me that I needed to observe more before saying anything. That night, I hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, the phrase, responsible family member, came back to my mind. I had never signed any documents. I had never agreed to hand over my decisions to anyone. So how could anyone confirm something on my behalf? The idea that they were deciding for me, without my consent, made my stomach turn. It wasn't just about medicines. It was about control. The next morning, I woke up with a slight dizziness and a bitter taste in my mouth. I looked at the glass of water and the pill on the bedside table. For the first time, I didn't take it right away. I stared at that little object, thinking about how many small things can destroy a life when placed in the wrong hands. I felt fear, but I also felt something new emerging, still fragile, distrust. I spent the day quietly, more than usual. My daughter interpreted this as tiredness, perhaps confusion. I let her believe that. Inside, however, my mind was working non-stop. I remembered old episodes, decisions made by her without consulting me, comments about my house, about inheritance, about how much easier everything would be if I didn't have to worry about anything. Things that I had previously ignored, now gained another weight. When the phone rang again at night, my whole body reacted. It wasn't the office this time, but fear had already taken root. I realized then that morning call had not been just a mistake. She had been the beginning of something much bigger. Something that threatened not only my health, but my freedom. And at that moment, even scared, I made a silent promise to myself, I would not disappear in silence. My daughter started to arrive earlier in the following days, always with the same justification, be careful. She said that I was weak, that I needed someone around, that it was no longer safe for me to be alone. Her tone was not aggressive, but too firm to be just affectionate. Each sentence was loaded with a certainty that did not include me. I listened in silence, watching how she moved around the house as if it were already hers, opening drawers, rearranging papers, moving objects around without asking me anything. She knew exactly where my documents were. This began to bother me deeply. One day I saw her come out of my room with a brown briefcase in her hands, the one where I kept old contracts, house bills and the deed. When I asked her what she was doing, she replied matter-of-factly that she was just organizing everything to make it easier in the future. Future. That word gave me an immediate shiver. It wasn't the future I imagined, but the future she seemed to have already planned without me. I started to pay attention to small things. The way she answered for me on the phone, how she corrected my lines in front of others, how she sighed when I took a long time to remember something. It wasn't just impatience. It was disqualification. Gradually, I began to feel that my presence there was becoming decorative, almost an obstacle to the efficiency she valued so much. And the most painful thing was to realize that I myself had helped to build that situation, trusting too much. One afternoon, a neighbor knocked on the door to invite me for coffee. Before I could answer, my daughter stepped forward, saying that I was too tired for visits. I saw the neighbor's confused look, but I didn't have the strength to contradict it. When the door closed, I felt a deep shame. Not because I was weak, but because they were deciding who could or could not talk to me. The isolation began there, almost invisibly. When it was time for the medicines, she started to watch me while I took each pill. If I hesitated, she got angry. She said that the doctor had advised me like this, that I needed to trust her. The word trust began to sound like a threat to me. Trusting, in that context, seemed to mean obeying. And I had never been a submissive woman. Age hadn't erased that from me, just dormant for a while. At times, she seemed sincerely worried. He prepared food, arranged the house, asked if I was comfortable. This confused me even more. The mix of real care with calculated control left me disoriented. I wondered if I was exaggerating, if that suspicion was the result of my age. But something inside me insisted, those who love do not erase the other little by little. I also began to notice the way she talked about money. Loose, seemingly harmless comments about the cost of my treatments, about how everything would be simpler if someone took on these responsibilities. In one of these conversations, he mentioned that I had lived long enough, that now it was time to rest. That hurt me deeply. It wasn't rest she wanted for me. It was silence. At night, alone in the room, I relived every conversation, every gesture. I remembered when she was a teenager, the arguments, the coldness that arose after her father's death. I always tried to compensate, give more, give more. Perhaps that was the mistake. To teach that I would always give up myself to keep the peace. Now, that lesson was being used against me. In the midst of this turmoil, I began to feel something other than fear. It was a bitter lucidity. The feeling that if I did nothing, I would cease to exist before I even died. Not physically, but as a person. As someone with the right to choose. That realization hurt, but it also woke me up. For the first time, I seriously thought that I needed to act, even though I didn't know how yet. When I lay down that night, I heard my daughter fiddling with papers in the living room. Each sound sounded louder than it actually was. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't sleep. I was no longer just a worried mother. I was becoming a woman on alert. And although I was still fragile on the outside, something inside me was beginning to harden. The fact that you are here, listening to this story so far, says a lot about your sensitivity and attention to what really matters. What follows is not just a personal account, it is a truth that is repeated in many homes, quietly, every day. If you believe that these stories need to continue to be told, to protect, alert and give voice to those who almost didn't have it, subscribe to the channel and walk with me. In the days that followed, my body began to react in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't just tiredness. It was sudden dizziness, a tightness in my chest that came without warning, a strange weakness in my legs, as if they no longer wanted to support me. The most disturbing thing was the pattern. It always happened after my daughter organized my medicines. Always after she said, in that firm voice, that I needed to trust her and stop worrying about details. There was a morning when I woke up with my heart racing too much, as if I had run a marathon while sleeping. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to catch my breath, and I felt a metallic taste in my mouth. I looked at the nightstand and saw the pill she had left there the night before. For a few seconds, I thought about not taking it, but the fear of getting worse spoke louder. I swallowed it with water, even with my stomach turned, and waited for the effect that was already beginning to become predictable. Shortly after, I had to lean on the wall to keep from falling. The world seemed to spin slowly but steadily, as if I were stuck on a merry-go-round that no one else saw. I called my daughter, and she appeared quickly, with a look that mixed concern and something I couldn't name. He helped me sit down, brought water, but it didn't seem surprised. That hit me like a silent blow. It was as if she was already expecting that reaction. She said it was normal, that my body was adjusting, that the doctor had warned that it could happen. She spoke with such conviction that it almost made me doubt myself. Almost. Because, deep down, I knew that it wasn't normal. I had been taking medication all my life. I knew my body better than anyone else. That feeling was not one of adjustment. It was something wrong. I started to live in a state of alert, paying attention to every sign of my body. I began to realize that there were days when I felt relatively well, especially when I was able to take the meds on my own, before my daughter arrived. In others, when she made a point of supervising everything, the symptoms came back with a vengeance. This realization scared me more than any physical pain. The idea that someone could be deliberately interfering with my health took me off my feet. I started to feel afraid to sleep. Fear of waking up worse. Fear of not waking up. At night, I kept my eyes open, listening to the sounds of the house, trying to understand when my life had left my hands. I thought about my husband, how he always said that I was strong, that no one decided for me. Remembering this made me want to cry, but it also reminded me of who I had been before they made me small. My daughter, on the other hand, seemed more and more sure of herself. He talked to doctors, solved matters over the phone, made decisions without consulting me. When I tried to question something, she would say that I was confused, that it was for my own good. That sentence began to provoke a silent anger in me. Because my own good had never been defined by me. It was always something she decided on her own. On one of those difficult days, I noticed something that chilled my blood. She wrote things down in a notebook while I described my symptoms. It was not a gesture of care. It was a record. As if he was collecting evidence that I was not well. That realization changed everything. It wasn't just about control. There was a greater intention, something being built calmly and patiently, as I struggled to stay on my feet. It was then that I started to pretend more than ever. Pretending that he was fine, that he trusted, that he didn't understand anything. Every smile of mine was a conscious effort. Each thanks, a strategy. I needed to gain time. He needed to understand what was happening before it was too late. For the first time, I stopped being just a worried mother and became a woman watching her own siege close. That night, as I felt my heart slowly slow down after yet another episode, I had a clear and frightening certainty. My body was failing, yes. But not because of age. I was failing because someone was messing with the invisible wires that kept me alive. And if I wanted to survive, it was no longer enough to trust. I would have to prove it. The appointment was scheduled at the insistence of my daughter. She said that my symptoms were worse and that the doctor needed to adjust something. I agreed, but inside I felt a tight knot. Something in me said that that trip to the office would not be like the others. From the moment we entered, I noticed that she spoke more than usual, answered questions that were not directed at her and made a point of reinforcing my fragility. I remained silent, watching, feeling my heart beat too hard inside my chest. The doctor, a man with a watchful eye and a calm voice, began by asking simple questions. As I was sleeping, if I ate well, I felt dizzy. My daughter would answer before I could open my mouth. He wrote it down, but something on his face seemed bothered. At one point, she looked up from the paper and looked directly at me, not at her. That simple gesture made me straighten my posture. It had been a long time since anyone looked at me like that, as someone who still exists. He politely asked me to answer for myself. My daughter tried to intervene, saying that I was easily confused, but he raised his hand and insisted. It was then that the question came. He wanted to know if I knew exactly what medications I was taking at that time and at what dosage. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words didn't come out. A heavy silence settled in the room. For the first time, I felt ashamed not of my age, but of my situation. The doctor waited. He didn't hurry me, he didn't look away. That silence was more revealing than any answer. I nodded slowly, admitting that I didn't know for sure. My daughter reacted immediately, explaining that she had taken on this responsibility because I was forgetful. Her tone was defensive, almost aggressive. The doctor, however, did not seem convinced. He wrote something down more strongly than before, as if that information had a greater weight than all my symptoms combined. Then he asked to see the list of medications. My daughter handed in the papers with excessive security. As he compared the information, he asked more questions. Technical, specific questions that revealed small inconsistencies. I noticed the change in the environment. The air became tense. My daughter crossed her arms, restless. I, on the other hand, felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. For the first time, someone seemed to see that there was something wrong besides my health. The doctor asked when the last change in dosage had been made. My daughter responded quickly, citing a recent date. He frowned and said that there was no adjustment authorized by him in that period. The silence returned, even heavier. My heart raced. I felt small, but I also felt a flame ignite inside me. That was the first visible crack in the story she had been telling. He then said something that changed everything. He said that, in situations like that, he needed to confirm if the patient was aware of and in agreement with any change. He looked at me again and asked if anyone had asked my permission. I shook my head in denial. My voice came out weak but clear. No. That word echoed inside me like a scream I had been holding for days. My daughter tried to minimize it, saying that she was just helping, that everything was for my good. But the doctor did not back down. I said that it needed to be investigated carefully, because improper alterations could put my life at risk. Hearing someone say it out loud made my stomach turn. It wasn't paranoia. It was not an exaggeration. It was a real risk. When we left the office, my daughter was different. I didn't talk, I didn't smile, I didn't try to calm down. I also remained silent. Inside me, a certainty was slowly formed, heavy and painful. That simple question had opened a door that could no longer be closed. Nothing would ever be the same again. That night, lying in bed, I relived every second of the appointment. I realized that this doctor had been the first person to see me not as a frail elderly woman, but as someone who needed to be protected from those he claimed to care for. The strange question had not only been medical, it had been a wake-up call. And I knew that, from then on, the investigation was no longer his alone. It was mine too. After the appointment, something in me changed places. It wasn't courage yet, but it was attention. I started to observe everything more carefully, as someone who walks on unstable ground and measures each step. That same night, I waited for my daughter to sleep and went to the kitchen in silence. I opened the drawer where she kept the medicines and placed them on the table, one by one. I observed colors, shapes, smells. I took an old notebook, forgotten at the bottom of a drawer, and I felt that it would be my only ally at that moment. I started by writing down simple things, times, names, how I felt before and after taking each pill. At first, I thought it was exaggerated, almost a betrayal on my part to distrust my own daughter. But the first episode of dizziness recorded on paper was enough for doubt to give way to need. It was no longer about feelings. It was about facts. Each line written was an anchor that held me to reality, preventing them from convincing me that everything was just in my head. I started to hide the notebook in the back of the closet, behind clothes that I hardly wore anymore. Every time I picked him up, my heart raced, as if I was committing a crime. It was ironic. I felt guilty for trying to protect myself. I also wrote down my daughter's behavior, the days when she seemed most impatient, the times when she insisted on giving me medicine at different times. The more I wrote, the clearer it became that there was a pattern. There was a day when I decided to try something simple. I took only part of the medicines she had separated, pretending to have swallowed them all. I spent the rest of the day paying attention to my body's signals. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the severe dizziness, nor the tightness in my chest. That made me cold. It was not relief. It was confirmation. I wrote everything down with trembling hands, feeling a huge weight on my chest. I wanted to be wrong. I wish it was just a coincidence. But it wasn't. My daughter realized that something was different. He began to watch me more closely, to ask too many questions. If I said I was fine, she was suspicious. If I complained, she wrote it down. That became a silent, dangerous game. I needed to act carefully, measure words, control expressions. Feigning fragility has become a strategy. The more she saw me as helpless, the less she imagined that I was recording everything. At night, I reread my own notes like someone reading a forbidden diary. Each page showed me a version of my life that I had never imagined living. It wasn't just the disease that threatened me. It was the loss of my identity. I was being transformed, little by little, into someone incapable in the eyes of others. And maybe, if I wasn't careful, also in my own eyes. I remembered the times when I heard stories of deceived elderly people, manipulated by those they claimed to love. I always thought that this would never happen to me. I was attentive, strong, lucid. That memory brought me a mixture of shame and anger. Betrayal hurts more when it comes with the humiliation of realizing that you also helped to allow it. But along with that pain came a new, quiet determination. I started to hide a few different pills, comparing them with old photos of the prescriptions. The differences were subtle, but they existed. Changed dosages, changed schedules. Everything seemed too small to attract attention, but big enough to weaken me. I wrote everything down, with an almost obsessive precision. That notebook was no longer just a record. It became a test. At times, I thought about confronting her immediately. In others, I felt like giving up, giving everything and letting her decide for me. But then I would look at those hard-written pages and remember who I was. I had not reached the age of 72 to disappear without a fight. Even if my fight was silent, even if no one else saw it. That night, as I put the notebook away once more, I noticed something with frightening clarity. I wasn't just recording symptoms. I was building my defense. Each note was a step out of the trap that was closing around me. I still didn't know how or when, but I was sure of one thing: those pages would change everything. As I was writing my notes, old memories began to emerge without my inviting them. Situations that, for years, I had explained as my daughter's difficult temperament or bad phase now took on another meaning. I remembered the first arguments after her father's death, the sudden coldness, the veiled accusations of abandonment, even though I had done everything alone. At the time, I thought it was unresolved pain. Today, I realize that perhaps it was the beginning of something much deeper. There was one specific episode that came back to my mind with force. Years ago, when I first got sick, my daughter insisted on taking over my finances temporarily. He said I needed to rest, that it was just for a while. When I tried to regain control, she was upset, almost offended. At that moment, I apologized. I apologized for wanting to mind my own business. Now, as I remembered this, I felt a knot of revolt form in my chest. I started to revisit old conversations, phrases said casually, but loaded with intention. Comments about how my house was too big for me, about how I lived stuck in the past, about how much more practical it would be if everything was in the name of someone younger. At the time, I saw it as a concern. Today, it sounded like a rehearsal. As if she had been laying the groundwork for years, waiting only for the right moment to act. I also remembered how she was always interested in stories of inheritance, family disputes, cases in which children took over everything because their parents could no longer handle it. I always listened in silence, without imagining that those stories were not just curiosity. They were inspiration. Thinking about it caused me deep pain, not only for the betrayal, but for the coldness with which everything seemed to have been planned. The more I relived the past, the more I realized that the manipulation had not started now, with the medicines. That was just the most dangerous step. Before that, there were small invasions, small decisions made by me, small concessions I made to avoid conflicts. Each of them had made room for the next. The betrayal did not come suddenly. It was built with patience. I felt a heavy sadness when I accepted this. It wasn't easy to admit that someone I loved had spent so many years watching me as an opportunity. I thought about all the times I defended my daughter to other people, saying that she was just too practical, too direct. I protected her while she learned exactly where I was most vulnerable. This realization made me cry in silence that night. At the same time, these memories awakened something new in me. A painful but necessary clarity. Understanding that this was not a recent impulse, but part of an old plan, made me stop blaming myself. It was not weakness. It was trust betrayed. And betrayed trust is not resolved with emotional talk. It is solved with strategy. I started to see my notes in a different light. They were not only evidence of the present, but the continuation of a long story, which now had to be interrupted. I wasn't just dealing with a controlling daughter. I was dealing with someone who had been slowly pushing me out of life for years. And that required more than courage. It required preparation. The next morning, I woke up with a quiet determination. It was not explosive anger, nor a desire for immediate revenge. It was something colder and firmer. I needed to protect not only my body, but everything I had built throughout my life. My home, my history, my dignity. The past had come back to warn me, not to paralyze me. As I closed the notebook that day, I felt that I finally understood the dimension of what I was facing. The betrayal was not only current, she had deep roots. And to cut them, I would have to go beyond fear and guilt. I would have to face the whole truth, even if it meant definitively losing the illusion of who my daughter really was. The discovery happened by chance, but nothing about it tasted like coincidence. My daughter had left in a hurry that morning, leaving on the living room table a folder I had never seen before. Normally, I wouldn't touch anything that was hers. But something in me no longer accepted limits imposed by fear. I opened the folder carefully, feeling my heart beating too strongly, as if each page could confirm what I had feared since the doctor's appointment. The documents were cold, objective, written in a language that did not admit affection. There were legal terms, mentions of my health, evaluations of my ability to make decisions. My name appeared repeatedly, always accompanied by words like incapacity, risk, and interdiction. I had to sit down. That was not an abstract plan. It was an ongoing process. A plan to take away from me the right to decide about my own life. I continued reading, even with blurry vision. There was a list of assets, including my house, described as assets to be managed by a legal guardian. There was no doubt who was responsible. My stomach turned. It wasn't just about medicine. It had never been. It was about total control. About turning my existence into an administrative detail. What shocked me the most was realizing that some documents were almost ready to be signed. Only definitive medical reports were missing. Reports that could be easily manipulated if I remained weak, confused, discredited. The call from the office, the altered dosages, the records she made of my symptoms, everything fit together with a cruel clarity. I was being pushed, slowly, into a role that wasn't mine. I felt a mixture of fear and indignation that almost made me lose my breath. I thought about how many decisions had already been made without me. I thought about how underestimated I had been. The thought of being declared incapable, of losing my home, my independence, my voice, caused me deep pain, but it also aroused something fierce. That wasn't just betrayal. It was silent violence. I carefully closed the folder and placed it exactly where it was. My hands were shaking, but my mind was strangely clear. I needed to act more cautiously than ever. Any misstep could speed up that process. My daughter could not know that I had seen those documents. Not yet. I needed proof, allies, and, above all, time. When she returned home that afternoon, she behaved as if nothing had happened. He smiled, asked if I was better, commented on the traffic. I replied in kind, feigning normalcy, while inside her every word sounded false. I came to see her no longer as my daughter, but as someone who carried out a plan. This change in perspective was painful but necessary. That night, I hardly slept. The image of the word interdiction kept in my head. I thought about what it would mean to lose the right to decide how far I could live, who could visit me, what I could or could not do. I thought about how much my life could be reduced to a report. The fear was great, but, curiously, it no longer paralyzed me. He pushed me forward. I grabbed my notebook and started a new section. It was no longer just a symptom diary. It was a survival plan. I listed everything I needed to protect, everything that was at risk, and everything I could still do on my own. For the first time, I felt that I was taking back some of the control that had been stolen from me. As I wrote, I had a definite certainty. I could no longer rely solely on my perception. I needed someone from the outside, someone who understood laws, rights, silent abuses. The doctor had been the first sign. Now, I needed to go further. The threat had been fully revealed. And from that moment on, I knew I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was fighting for my freedom. After the discovery of the documents, the house began to look smaller, as if the walls were slowly approaching. My daughter started to control my schedules, my calls, and even my steps within her own home. He said it was to avoid accidents, but I knew it was to avoid witnesses. Each closed door, each visit canceled in my name, reinforced the feeling that I was being erased little by little, without noise, without apparent resistance. The calls I used to receive from friends have decreased. Some said that my daughter had warned me that I was not well, that I needed to rest, that visits left me confused. When I learned about this, I felt a deep shame. Not because I was sick, but because they were talking about me as if I were no longer present. I was still there, lucid, conscious, but being narrated by someone else, like a fragile object that needed to be put away. One morning, I heard my daughter talking on the phone in the living room. She spoke softly, but a few words came to me. She doesn't realize it, she's increasingly dependent, it's a matter of time. I stood in the hallway, feeling the icy ground beneath my feet, as those sentences pierced me like blades. It wasn't just planning. It was contempt. It was the certainty that I no longer had the right to my own image. When I tried to react to small things, I was treated with condescension. If I insisted on going out alone, she sighed, rolled her eyes, said I was being stubborn. If I disagreed with something, she smiled in that way that mixes pity and superiority. Each such gesture was a silent humiliation. There was no screaming, there was no explicit violence. There was something worse, the constant annulment. At a family lunch, I felt it even more clearly. My daughter spoke for me, told exaggerated stories about forgetfulness, made jokes about my age. The others laughed, embarrassed. I remained silent, feeling my face burn. That wasn't just a conversation. It was a staging carefully constructed to reinforce the image that I was no longer capable of. There, I realized how much isolation was not just physical. It was social. It was moral. I came back from that lunch with a huge weight on my chest. I didn't cry. The humiliation had left me dry inside. Instead, I felt a new coldness set in. Something that took me away from the immediate pain and put me in observation mode. Every comment, every gesture, started to be mentally registered. I needed to remember everything. That wasn't just suffering. It was material. I started to avoid direct confrontations. The more submissive I seemed, the more she relaxed her vigilance. I began to understand that my apparent fragility was, at that moment, a tool. It was not easy to swallow my pride, to accept looks of pity, but I knew that any impulsive reaction could be used against me. The game was now different, and I needed to play smart. At night, alone in the room, I felt the weight of isolation more intensely. The silent house, the closed door, the distant sound of the television in the living room. I thought about how many women like me had gone through that without anyone noticing. How many had been silenced by their own family, in the name of supposed protection. This awareness saddened me, but it also gave me strength. I didn't want to be another one of those invisible cases. I wrote in my notebook not only facts, but sensations. The way I was treated, the words used, the looks. All that was part of the violence I was experiencing. I didn't leave anything out. The more I wrote, the clearer it became that this was not just a family conflict. It was abuse. And abuse needs to be named to be addressed. When I finished that page, I took a deep breath and looked around the room. I was isolated, yes. Humiliated, too. But it was not defeated. Inside me, something remained intact, the certainty of who I was. They could try to reduce me, infantilize me, erase me. But as long as I could think, write, and plan, I still had a chance. And I didn't intend to waste it. The doctor called 2 days after the last appointment, at a time when my daughter was not at home. When I heard my voice being called from the other end of the line, I felt a tightness in my chest, as if my body knew that this conversation was important. He did not talk about tests or symptoms. He spoke of concern. He said that something in my case did not add up, that the changes in the medicines had not been authorized by him and that this needed to be treated seriously. That was the first time in a long time that I felt someone by my side. He asked me to go to the office alone, if possible. That word, alone, sounded almost strange in my ears. It was not a simple request. It was an invitation to resume something that had been taken away from me, autonomy. I made up some excuse for my daughter, saying that I needed to solve something at the bank, and I left home with my heart racing, feeling almost clandestine in my own life. In the office, the doctor received me differently. He closed the door, sat down in front of me, and spoke calmly but firmly. He said that, in addition to the risk to my health, there were clear signs of abuse against the elderly. Hearing that expression made a profound impact on me. Abuse. I never imagined that this word could apply to my story, but at that moment, it all made sense. It wasn't an exaggeration, it wasn't drama. It was real. I told him about the notes, about the documents I found, about isolation. As I spoke, he listened in silence, taking notes, nodding his head. At no time did he interrupt me or minimize what I was saying. That, in itself, was already a form of healing. For the first time, I didn't have to prove that I was lucid. I was simply heard. It was then that he mentioned a lawyer who specializes in cases like mine. He said that he had seen similar stories, which often began exactly like this, with small interferences in health. That information scared me, but it also strengthened me. I wasn't alone. It was not an isolated case. There were legal paths, there was protection, there was a way out. When he asked me if I would be willing to talk to this lawyer, I felt a mixture of fear and relief. Accepting help meant admitting that the situation was serious. It meant crossing a line of no return. But at that point, I knew there was no way I could fake it anymore. I nodded, feeling my hands sweat. It was the most important decision I had made in years. I left the office with a folded paper in my bag, with a name and a phone number written down. It seemed little, but for me it was everything. It was proof that someone believed in me, that my story had weight. I walked slowly to the car, feeling the sun on my face, taking a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, I didn't just feel threatened. I felt myself moving. When I got home, my daughter asked where I had been. I replied naturally, saying that I had resolved some pending issues. She watched me for a few seconds longer than usual, as if trying to read something on my face. I kept my expression neutral. Inside, however, I was different. Something had changed its position. I was no longer completely cornered. That evening, I wrote at length in my notebook about the meeting. Every detail, every word from the doctor, every sensation. That record was different from the others. It was not just denunciation. It was cautious hope. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that I would face confrontations, lies, and perhaps reprisals. But now I had an ally. And that changed the game. Before going to sleep, I held the paper with the lawyer's name once again. I thought about everything that was at risk, but also about what could still be saved. My life didn't have to end in that narrative of fragility and silence. For the first time, I envisioned a future in which I was not just a victim, but an active part of my own defense. And that, for me, was already a form of victory. After the conversation with the doctor, I understood that any hasty move could put everything to waste. I could not confront, accuse, or show distrust. I needed to remain exactly who they believed I was, fragile, confused, dependent. That was the hardest part, feigning vulnerability when, inside, I was more awake than ever. But I understood that that mask would be my greatest protection. I started to measure every word I said. If my daughter asked how I was, I exaggerated the weakness a little. If he commented something about forgetfulness, I agreed. That hurt my pride, but it strengthened my position. The more she felt safe, the more careless she became. I watched in silence, mentally registering every detail, every contradiction, every rush to control myself. At the same time, I started to organize my exams more carefully. I separated the notebook into parts, hid copies of documents in different places, memorized important passwords. I did all this slowly and discreetly, without creating new patterns that could attract attention. I learned that, in situations like that, silence can be more powerful than any direct accusation. The lawyer called me for the first time on a rainy afternoon. I spoke quietly, in the room, with the door locked. She listened to my story carefully and explained to me, with frightening clarity, how cases like mine used to evolve. He said I was right not to act impulsively. That gathering evidence and maintaining the appearance of normalcy was essential. That conversation gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. I started to look at my daughter no longer with pain, but with analysis. I observed when she got angry, when she felt upset, when she lost her temper. These moments revealed much more than words. I saw how much she needed me to be small for her plan to work. And that gave me a quiet advantage. While she underestimated me, I strengthened myself. There were days when loneliness almost overcame me. Faking it all the time is exhausting. At night, when no one saw, I cried. Not only for betrayal, but for the cruel reversal of roles. I, who had been careful, now had to defend myself. But each tear shed was followed by a firm decision: I would not back down. Not after everything I had already understood. I also started to think about the right moment. The lawyer had been clear: The confrontation would need to take place when the evidence was irrefutable. No emotional accusations. No explosions. It would be a cold, almost clinical encounter. This idea scared me, but it also strengthened me. I didn't seek revenge. He sought protection and truth. My daughter seemed more and more confident. He spoke of the future, of decisions that would be made soon, of how everything would be simpler. I nodded, smiled, nodded. Inside, each sentence of hers became another piece of the puzzle that I put together in silence. She didn't realize that the game had changed. And that was exactly what I needed. At times, I even wondered if I would have the strength to go to the end. The fear still existed. The risk was real. But there was something bigger now, consciousness. I knew what was going on. And knowledge changes everything. There is no way to go back to ignorance once the truth is so clearly presented. That night, before going to sleep, I calmly reread my notes. I no longer saw only pain and confusion there. I saw strategy, resistance, lucidity. I was still surrounded, still threatened. But it was no longer passive. The silent strategy was underway. And, even without anyone noticing, I had already taken the first steps towards the confrontation that would change everything. I noticed the change in her behavior before I even understood why. My daughter started to be more impatient, less careful with her words, as if she believed that the outcome was guaranteed. Small slips began to emerge. Cross comments, orders disguised as advice, a tone of urgency that did not exist before. It was as if she was tired of pretending. And this fatigue made her make mistakes. One morning, she contradicted herself when talking about an appointment that, according to her, had already been scheduled for weeks. When I asked for details, he hesitated, changed his version, said he would still confirm it. I watched in silence. That insecurity was not common in her. I mentally wrote down every pause, every poorly chosen word. Those who control everything do not usually stumble over their own narrative. That was a clear sign that something was going off track. I also began to notice the growing irritation when I asked simple questions. These were not confrontations, just innocent doubts, the kind a confused lady would make. But it was enough for me to insist a little for her to lose her patience. Long sighs, hard looks, dry answers. That facade of a devoted daughter began to crack, revealing a nervousness she could no longer hide. There was a day when she spoke too loudly to me. Nothing explicit, but the tone was enough to hurt me. Soon after, she tried to correct herself, saying that she was stressed, that she did everything by herself. That justification hit me deeply. It was not true. I have always been there. I was the one who took care of it, who supported it, who gave it up. Now, I was presented as a burden. This inversion hurt me more than any legal document. I began to notice that she was talking more and more about deadlines. Soon, we can't postpone it anymore. These words came up in seemingly banal conversations, but they carried a barely concealed anxiety. It was as if she was running against something. Perhaps against time. Perhaps against the possibility of me proving that I was still fully capable. This haste made her less careful, more exposed. One late afternoon, I heard her again in the living room. This time, he didn't try to speak softly. He commented on reports, on the need to solve it soon, and on how I was increasingly difficult. That comment hurt me, but it also confirmed something important. I wasn't imagining anything. The plan existed, it was in progress, and now it was beginning to show flaws. At the same time, I began to notice changes in the way others saw us. Some people were surprised by her authoritarian tone. A neighbor even commented that I looked much better than they said. Small questions arose, still timid, but real. The narrative she had been building was beginning to meet resistance. And that made her visibly uncomfortable. Inside, I stood firm. Each slip of hers reinforced my conviction. I no longer felt that paralyzing guilt. The fear still existed, but now it was accompanied by clarity. I knew I was close to something important. The balance of forces was changing, albeit slowly. And she seemed to realize it, even without knowing exactly how. There was one night when she tried to pressure me directly, saying that some decisions would need to be made, with or without my agreement. I feigned confusion, asked her what she was talking about. She got angry, raised her voice, and then abruptly shut up, as if she had talked too much. That was a serious mistake. An error that I recorded accurately in my notebook. As I lay down that night, I felt something other than fear. It was a silent expectation. The mask began to fall, and with it came proof that I was not wrong. She could no longer sustain the character of an exemplary caregiver. And when someone loses control of their own mask, they come dangerously close to revealing everything. I knew the confrontation was approaching. And this time, I would be ready. The meeting was scheduled for an afternoon that seemed too ordinary to carry something so definitive. My daughter said it would just be a conversation to organize things, but the serious tone with which she spoke denounced the importance of the moment. I already knew what was coming. Even so, I felt my legs weaken as I got ready. It was not fear of what would be said, but of what would finally be exposed. Some truths, when they come out of the dark, change everything forever. When we arrived, the doctor was already in the room, accompanied by a woman I immediately recognized by the description, the lawyer. She greeted me respectfully, looking me straight in the eye. That simple gesture gave me strength. My daughter seemed uncomfortable seeing her there, but tried to maintain her posture. She sat upright, with her arms crossed, as if believing she was still in control of the situation. The conversation began in a polite, almost protocol way. They talked about health, care, routine. My daughter took the floor several times, describing my difficulties with exaggeration. As she spoke, I watched her gestures, her haste, the way she avoided looking at me. The lawyer remained silent, writing everything down. So does the doctor. That silence was not neutral. It was strategic. At a certain point, the lawyer asked me to speak. My daughter tried to intervene, saying that I was confused under pressure. But the lawyer was firm. I said that my voice was essential in that meeting. I took a deep breath and started talking. Not with exaggerated emotion, not with accusations. I only reported facts. What I used to take before. Which has changed. How I felt. The silence in the room became heavy. When I mentioned the changes in dosages without my authorization, I saw my daughter move in her chair. The doctor calmly confirmed that he had not prescribed those changes. The lawyer then put some documents on the table. My notes, copies of recipes, date records. Everything organized, of course, impossible to ignore. For the first time, I felt that I didn't need to justify myself. The evidence spoke for me. My daughter tried to argue, saying that everything had been done for my good. The lawyer then asked why there were interdiction documents being prepared without my knowledge. My daughter's face changed color. She hesitated, stuttered, tried to divert the subject. That hesitation was more revealing than any confession. There, her narrative began to collapse in a visible way. The atmosphere became tense. There were no screams, but there was something stronger, embarrassment. The kind of embarrassment that arises when someone realizes that they have been unmasked in front of witnesses. I remained calm, almost distant, watching. That serenity was not weakness. It was the result of weeks of preparation. I knew exactly why I was there and what was at stake. The lawyer explained, firmly, that any attempt at interdiction based on manipulated information could constitute a crime. The doctor reinforced the real risks to my health. Their every word seemed to push my daughter into an unseen corner of the room. For the first time, she had no control of the situation. And that left her vulnerable. In a moment of silence, my daughter looked at me. There was no regret there. There was frustration. That hurt more than I expected. But it also confirmed something important. I wasn't wrong to go there. That was not a mess. It was a struggle for power. And, for the first time, I was not alone in that dispute. When the meeting ended, nothing was officially resolved yet. But something had changed irreversibly. The cards were on the table. The masks had fallen. As I left the room, I felt a deep tiredness, but also a strange sense of relief. The decisive meeting had not been the end. It had been the beginning of the real confrontation. And I knew that the next step would be even harder. This is the hardest part to tell, because when I get here I stop protecting not only memories, but people I once loved. Sharing this has a real cost. It touches wounds that have never fully closed, but that need to be exposed so that they do not continue to hurt in silence. If you've stayed up to this point, it's because you understand the weight of hearing a truth that wasn't meant to be comfortable. That's why I ask you to sign up, not as a support for me, but as a way to ensure that stories like this continue to have a voice, even when speaking out hurts. The confrontation did not take place in a crowded courtroom, as I imagined in my anxious moments, but it was public enough that it was never erased. The next meeting included other professionals, a representative of social services and 2 family members that my daughter had called to reinforce her version. When I entered the room, I felt all eyes on me, evaluating my posture, my way of walking, looking for signs of fragility. For the first time, I didn't lower my head. That, in itself, has already caused visible discomfort. My daughter started talking, as always. She repeated the story of her confused mother, of constant worry, of the weight she carried alone. He used beautiful, rehearsed, almost emotional words. As she spoke, I noticed something curious. No one interrupted me when I took a deep breath or adjusted my posture. It was as if everyone was waiting for my turn. That quiet expectation gave me strength. I was no longer an extra in my own story. When I was asked to speak, I looked up and started slowly. I didn't make speeches. I didn't cry. I reported facts, dates, physical sensations, decisions made without my consent. I showed the notes, the recipes, the interdiction documents. With each test presented, I felt the environment change. What was once doubt began to turn into collective discomfort. The narrative of the exemplary caregiver was no longer sustained in the face of so many details. The most tense moment came when the social service representative asked my daughter directly why I hadn't been informed about the legal documents. She tried to justify herself, said it was for my good, that I wouldn't understand. The answer went down badly. Very badly. For the first time, someone openly questioned her right to decide for me. That simple question exposed the heart of it all. She didn't want to care. I wanted to control. I felt a lump in my throat when I realized that outsiders saw it more clearly than I had seen it for years. It was not easy to hear someone describe, in technical terms, the abuse I was experiencing. But it was also liberating. What once seemed like an intimate drama was now recognized as something serious, concrete, real. I was no longer alone in that truth. My daughter began to change. The voice rose, the arguments became confused, the contradictions appeared. Each attempt to defend himself only deepened the exposure. I saw in her something I had never seen before: fear. Not to lose myself, but to lose control. That was devastating and enlightening at the same time. There was no wounded love there. There was a threatened plan. At one point, one of the family members who were present looked at me with surprise and said that I seemed much more lucid than I imagined. That simple sentence almost made me cry. Not by external validation, but by all that I had lost along the way. How many times had my lucidity been ignored because it was more convenient to believe my daughter's version? The lawyer was direct in stating that any attempt at interdiction would be suspended immediately until an independent evaluation. He also said that there would be legal consequences if the manipulation of medicines was proven. The silence that followed was heavy. My daughter didn't answer. For the first time since the beginning of everything, she had no words. When the meeting ended, I felt a deep tiredness, as if my body could finally relax after weeks of alertness. But along with the fatigue came something new: respect. In the looks, in the gestures, in the way they addressed me. I was no longer the confused lady. I was the person at the center of the decision. As I left the room, I walked slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had been exposed. The truth had come out, and there was no longer any way to hide it. The public confrontation had not solved everything, but it had changed the game definitively. From then on, nothing could be decided without me. And that, after all, was a huge victory. After the public confrontation, the house was never the same. The silence that settled there was not one of peace, but of rupture. My daughter began to walk through the rooms with hard steps, avoiding my gaze, avoiding any conversation that was not strictly necessary. The aura of control she had always carried seemed to have dissipated. For the first time, I saw in her someone lost, without a script, without the mastery of the narrative that she cherished so much. The phone calls began in the following days. People who used to only talk to her now wanted to talk to me. Doctors, social workers, even distant family members. Everyone wanted to confirm information, hear my version, understand how I was. Each call was a small reversal of power. I answered calmly, without exaggeration, just telling the truth. And the truth, I realized, didn't have to be shouted to be devastating. My daughter tried to keep up appearances for a while. She continued saying that she did everything out of love, that she had been misunderstood. But the mask no longer sticked. The contradictions were many, the evidence was clear, and people's views had changed. She was no longer seen as the devoted daughter, but as someone under suspicion. It corroded her. I saw it in the harsh way he closed doors, in the impatience when talking to me, in the silence full of resentment. There was a moment when she tried to confront me alone, in the kitchen, away from witnesses. She said that I had exposed her, that I had exaggerated, that now everyone looked at her differently. Hearing that was painful, but also revealing. At no time did she talk about what I felt, the risk I took, the fear I experienced. He spoke only of his own image. There, any doubt that was still inside me dissipated. I listened to her in silence, as I had learned to do. Not for submission, but for clarity. When she finished, I replied with a tranquility that disconcerted her. She said that I had exposed nothing but the truth, and that if the truth harmed her, it was not my responsibility. That sentence seemed to take the floor off her. For the first time, there was no way to blame me, diminish me, or shut me up. In the following days, practical decisions began to be made. With the support of the lawyer, I defined new people responsible for my medical care, reorganized documents, and established clear limits. My daughter has been officially removed from any control over my health and my assets. Signing those papers was one of the hardest acts of my life, not because of bureaucracy, but because of symbolism. It was the formal recognition that the bond had been broken. I felt mourning. A deep, silent mourning that no one saw. It was not only the loss of the relationship I imagined having with my daughter, but the loss of the illusion that love always protects. I cried alone a few nights, remembering the child she once was, the promises I made to myself. That pain did not disappear overnight. She settled down, found a place inside me. At the same time, I felt something I didn't expect: lightness. The constant tension had subsided. I slept better, breathed better, thought more clearly. My body, which had previously failed, now seemed to respond positively to the resumption of control. It was as if he also knew that the immediate danger had passed. This quiet improvement was a powerful confirmation of all that I had faced. People started to treat me differently. With more respect, more attention, more true care. Not care that infantilizes, but that which recognizes limits without erasing the person. This moved me deeply. I didn't need to prove anything else. My posture, my speech, my story had spoken for me. The exemplary caregiver had fallen, and with her, the lie that imprisoned me. On a quiet afternoon, I sat alone in the living room and watched the light coming in through the window. I thought of all that I had lost, but also of all that I had regained. My voice, my dignity, my autonomy. The fall of the exemplary caregiver was not a spectacle. It was a painful, silent, and definitive process. And in that moment, I realized that despite all the losses, I was still standing. Gradually, I relearned how to live inside my own home. Not because I had forgotten how, but because that space had been tainted by fear and surveillance for too long. Walking around the room without feeling tension in my shoulders, choosing my schedules, deciding what to do with my day, all of this seemed too simple to have been lost, but too complex to be recovered effortlessly. Every small gesture of autonomy became a silent victory. My health improved almost immediately when the drugs returned to the correct dosages. The doctor confirmed what my body had been saying for weeks. The dizziness subsided, the tightness in the chest ceased, the constant fear began to recede. It was impossible not to feel revolt when I realized how much I had been weakened on purpose. But I turned that revolt into something more useful, vigilance and respect for myself. With the support of the lawyer, I reorganized my practical life. I updated documents, made everything clear, transparent, protected. It wasn't paranoia. It was prudence. For the first time, I made decisions thinking exclusively of myself, without guilt, without the need to please or avoid conflict. I learned that protecting one's dignity is not selfishness. It's survival. My relationship with my daughter has not officially broken down, but it has changed irreversibly. We speak little, with distance and coldness. There were no sincere apologies, no real attempts at reconciliation. And I accepted that. Some wounds do not heal as we would like. They just stop bleeding. I learned to live with this truth without trying to embellish it. There were moments of loneliness, yes. Especially at night, when the silence was heavier. At those times, I missed not the person my daughter had become, but the idea of family that I had carried for so many years. Allow me to feel this grief without haste, without shame. Because rebuilding also requires accepting what has been lost. Over time, I began to get closer to other people. Neighbors, acquaintances, small meetings that were previously denied to me. I discovered stories similar to mine, told in a low voice, full of fear and guilt. I realized that my experience was no exception. And as I shared my story, I felt something new, purpose. If I had gone through all that just to survive, it would have been enough. But maybe I could help others not to get lost on the same path. I started to participate in community meetings, to talk to professionals who dealt with elderly people in vulnerable situations. Not as a victim, but as someone who survived and learned. Each time someone listened to me attentively, I felt my voice grow even stronger. The woman who was almost silenced now spoke clearly and firmly. I haven't gone back to who I was before. And I didn't even want to. That Laura trusted too much, gave too much, always put herself in second place. The new Laura was more attentive, more strategic, less naive. I didn't lose sensitivity, but I gained limits. I didn't lose love, but I learned not to give it to those who use it as a tool of control. Sometimes I look back and feel a tightness in my chest. Not because of the pain itself, but because of the awareness of how much it happens every day, hidden inside seemingly normal houses. This thought saddens me, but it also keeps me alert. My story didn't have a perfect ending. It had a real ending. And that, today, is more than enough. When I look in the mirror now, I see a marked woman, yes, but whole. I'm not made of steel, as they say. I am made of difficult choices, silent resistance, and a truth that no one else can take from me. I survived the cruelest betrayal, the one disguised as care. And I move on, not as a victim, but as someone who learned, late, perhaps, but deeply, the value of never again giving one's life into the wrong hands. If this story touched you at any point, it's worth sharing. Not because it's my story, but because it reveals a silent pattern that affects many people and is almost never openly discussed. As you share, think about who needs to hear it right now. Sometimes this simple gesture is a real act of solidarity and can be the first step in breaking a dangerous silence. I'll stay here reading each comment carefully. Tell me, from which city and country are you watching this, and what about this story stayed with you? Your words really reach me, and they make a difference.